In this video, I'm going to talk about the difference between a tenancy in common and a joint tenancy. This is estate planning lawyer Michael Pevney, and I create estate plans for families in California. If you would like to set up a time to speak with me for free, you can follow the link in the description and go to ocestateplanlawyer.com. I offer free consultations. Now, when we take ownership to a home, to a piece of property, there are a couple of different ways, if you're buying a home with somebody else, that you can take ownership to that property. The first way is called a tenancy in common, and that is where each person, so if two people are buying a home, they each own a share of that property, and each person can do whatever they want with that share of property. So if you own it as tenants in common, 50-50, and it will say that on the deed, each person can do whatever they want with the property. That means that one person can even take out a mortgage on their share of the home. They can sell their share of the home. They can use it as collateral for another type of a loan just on their share of the home. And for estate planning purposes, the real important part to a tenancy in common means that when that person dies, their share of that tenancy in common, their share of the property gets distributed along with their estate plan. So that share can be passed along in their will to somebody else, and maybe more than one person, or that share can even be put inside of a trust, and now the trust owns that share. And the other person that you are a tenant in common with still owns their part of the property. And this can bring up difficulties sometimes because not a lot of people want to buy a half of a home. And if you want to sell the entire home, both parties need to agree. And it can make it even more difficult when it's owned 50-50, one person dies, maybe their kids inherit it, and maybe they have 3 kids. So now that 50% share is owned by 3 different people, and then the other half of it is owned by somebody else. And that can cause a lot of difficulty. And I see this situation come up a lot of times when siblings go in on a house together. And they don't really think a whole lot about how they're going to take title to the property. So I practice in California, and in California, when we do home closings, we typically do not have a lawyer there. We use a real estate agent or a real estate broker, and then we have the mortgage people and the title people and the escrow people, and we just sign a bunch of documents that are in front of us. And we don't usually take a lot of time to think about how we take title to the property and how that's going to affect things in the future. Namely, do you want to be able to sell your share, and what do you want to happen to your share after you pass away? Now, in contrast to a tenancy in common is a joint tenancy. And there's a feature that a joint tenancy, when you own a property in joint tenancy with somebody else, the feature is called a right of survivorship. What that means is the last person to die, the last person living, owns the entire property. Typically, this is what we see with married couples, right? When a married couple buys a house together, they buy it in joint tenancy. So husband and wife buy a house together, husband dies, usually the husband dies first, right? And now the wife completely owns that property because it is owned in joint tenancy with a right of survivorship. So similarly, obviously both people need to agree if they want to sell that property, but in a situation where maybe it's not a husband and a wife, maybe it's siblings that want to own a home, you need to think about what's going to happen when one of them dies, right? If one sibling wants to pass on their share to their kids and they pass away and it's owned in a joint tenancy, the person who passed away, the decedent's children, are actually going to get nothing. And the entire ownership is going to pass on to the surviving sibling, the other person that they purchased that house with. So it's just something to think about how you take title to a home, because it can cause a big mess in the future just based on a little checkbox that you didn't really think a lot about when you initially purchased the home. Now, for most of my clients, when I have a married couple, we typically put their home into a trust, a revocable living trust that's going to give you so much control and so much choice over about what happens to that property first when the first person dies and then when the second spouse dies. It's not going to be owned jointly by 3 different people because a lot of times one kid wants to sell it, one kid wants to rent it out, and one kid wants to live there, and all 3 people have to agree in order to sell the entire property if they own it as tenants in common, which is why we want to put it into a trust. So threw a lot of information out at you right there, but that is the big difference between a tenant in common, meaning you own a kind of a share that you can do whatever you want with of the home, and a joint tenancy that has along with it a right of survivorship. So the last person to survive owns the entire thing and they get to do whatever they want with it. If you have any questions about this or anything else related to property ownership or estate planning, and you haven't gotten that estate plan done yet and you live in California, you can set up a time to meet with me for free by going to ocestateplanlawyer.com. Thanks for watching.